system is the ability to obtain oxygen from the atmosphere and to get rid of CO2. So we need to obtain oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. So oxygen is in the form of oxygen gas. It's a molecule. CO2 is carbon dioxide, 2 oxygens and a carbon. So the reason we do this is actually for cellular respiration. So the reason why we breathe is ultimately to get oxygen to the cells. And does anybody remember that tick 211? What is the mitochondria that uses, excuse me, I said the answer. What is the organelle that uses oxygen? And it is the mitochondria. So the mitochondria uses oxygen to produce what type of molecule? Primarily? What is the universal currency of energy in the body? ATP. So ATP is a high energy molecule that can be used anywhere in the body. Okay? So ultimately, the reason why we breathe in and we breathe out is because of that mitochondria. And we did talk about the mitochondria on one of the recorded lectures because we talked about the endosymbiotic theory that says that the mitochondria were once a separate organism that became incorporated into the larger eukaryotic cell. And so they actually have their own DNA and are capable of reproducing inside of the cells, which is kind of cool. We have lots of mitochondria in our skeletal muscle, for example, because that needs a lot of energy. Okay, so when we look at respiration, we need to talk about the diffusion of gases. So diffusion is actually a passive process where molecules move from a higher to a lower concentration. And passive means that it does not take energy. So diffusion can happen in non-living systems. So perfume diffuses, like if I had a bottle of perfume and I left it open, the molecules would go from a high concentration inside the bottle, and then they would diffuse throughout the room. Okay? So diffusion is just kind of a physical law, like gravity. And so we want to design, or we need to design our systems so that we can take advantage of diffusion and not work against it, right? So diffusion is does not take energy. So we want our physical system or our biological system to take advantage of diffusion. So we want oxygen and carbon dioxide to use diffusion to move. We don't have to, we want to pump things into our body. So there is a law of diffusion, and this describes the rate. So this would be something you might study in physics, right? So if we look at the rate of diffusion, this equals D, big D, and I'll explain what that is in a minute. And I'm going to times this by my surface area, and then I'm going to times it. That's a times, that's not an X, right? That's in this equation. Delta P over little d. Okay. So I'm just presenting this to you so that then we can explore how respiratory systems have evolved to increase the rate of diffusion by the manipulation of these variables, okay? So big D, you do not really need to worry about. This is just a diffusion constant. You would need to worry about it if you were a physicist. because this is a property of the where the membrane over which diffusion is occurring. So this is just a property of the membrane. It's a constant. So it doesn't change. Okay. SA is surface area. Okay. Delta P is the difference in partial pressures of the gases. Okay. So partial pressure, when we're talking about gas, is the same thing as the concentration, right? So oxygen has a certain partial pressure that it contributes to the overall atmospheric pressure, right? So you can think of this as just the concentration of a gas. That says of gas, okay. And then little d is the distance over which diffusion must take place. Okay, so you'll notice in this equation, little d is underneath delta P, and so what that means is that it has the inverse relationship to rate of diffusion. So as we increase the distance over which the rate of diffusion takes place, we're going to decrease the rate of diffusion. The other variables are directly proportional. So if I increase surface area and if I increase delta P, I'm going to increase the rate of diffusion. Okay. So like, for example, when you look at somebody with emphysema, we're going to talk about different respiratory disorders, but emphysema, they tend to have really thick membranes. And that was going to decrease the ability of them to get oxygen. And so in order to, a person who has emphysema, what do you generally do for them if they cannot breathe? They walk around carrying, dragging along with them oxygen, right? So that oxygen is just increasing delta P to compensate for a large little d, right? So that would just, oxygen is just at a higher concentration when they're breathing it in. It's not pure oxygen, but they breathe it in, and that's going to increase the rate of diffusion, so increase their ability to take in oxygen, okay? So if we look at different organisms that we've already observed, oops, I guess I'll talk about respiratory surfaces. Respiratory surfaces, they need to be thin. They must be moist. And the reason why they must be moist is that oxygen has to be dissolved in water before it can diffuse. So oxygen and CO2 must be dissolved in water before diffusion occurs. So this is a problem because as a terrestrial organism, we are always losing water to our environment over our respiratory surface. So you all know that, like, if you sit in the car for too long with the windows up, you start to steam it up, right? Steam up the windows. That's the water that you are losing through breathing, okay? So we lose a lot of water because our respiratory surface has to be moist. And that is why our respiratory surface is buried inside our body, because we can affect the humidity of the air. We can actually humidify the air that is coming in and create more humidity in our lungs than if our lungs were near the surface of the body. Okay. And then they have to have a large surface area. So some of your organisms, oh, go ahead.
I was just wondering, with like bugs with hard exoskeletons.
I'm going to get to that. Yeah. Yeah. So they have a, they actually have holes in their abdomen, and it carries blood via tubes right to the cell. They have a really weird respiratory system. So if we look at some organisms, they lack respiratory systems, or they just use the surface of their skin. So does anybody remember what this organism, what phylum do you think this organism is in? Platyhelminthes, right? Not to be confused with those sea slugs, because this one is flat. And so they just use the surface of their skin. So your planaria were just breathing through the surface of their skin. They did not have a respiratory system. It was not linked to their mouth. Their pharynx was just their digestive system. When we look at some other organisms, like the echinoderms, they actually have gills on the surface of their body. And so here you can see the gills sticking up, right, through the surface of their body. And it's really interesting because they have these little pinchers also on the surface of their body that remove debris from the gills. So there's like these little tiny little extensions, and they have thousands of them. And it's constantly picking the debris off and removing it from the surface of the gill so that they can breathe. This organism would be in what phylum? Does anybody want to take a guess?
It wouldn't be
Nope.
The Myriapoda?
Nope.
because it's a marine worm.
It's a marine worm, so it is an annelid, right? So it is a polychaete, and so it has many bristles, and it actually uses its bristles as gills. And then we saw the bivalves, which were mollusks. Oops. They have gills, right? And then we see the crayfish. They had gills that were underneath their carapace. Okay. So insects have a really interesting respiratory system that is not associated with their mouth. So along their abdomen, they have little holes. And sometimes you can actually see the abdomen expand and contract, and that could be part of their breathing. And they have these tubes that extend into the body of the organism, and they actually branch off this extensive branching and deliver oxygen right to individual cells. And so you can see that the body cell is receiving a little tube of oxygen right to it. And obviously they have skeletal muscle just like we do. And you can see that their skeletal muscle, unlike ours, which is innervated by blood vessels, their skeletal muscle actually has respiratory tubes that go right to the skeletal muscles and feed the skeletal muscles oxygen.
And that process doesn't take any either?
Breathing does, yeah. So maybe moving the abdomen to get the air to flow would take a problem. And so here's another example of the respiratory tract. The opening to the respiratory tract in insects are called spiracles. Okay, so in our respiratory system, so we can talk about the humans or mammals in general. Our respiratory surface is buried deep into our lungs. And the respiratory surface is actually what are called alveoli. And so it looks like this. This is what is called a terminal bronchiole. So that is a little tube, and that terminal bronchiole shown here. We'll talk about the rest of the respiratory surface or system in a minute. But we have this terminal bronchioles. And so this is where our respiratory surface is located. So if we look at an image of it, this is where we have the diffusion of oxygen in. So it's picked up by the blood, and CO2 is dropped off by the blood, and that is our respiratory surface. So we'll put this is the respiratory surface. There is not diffusion of gases anywhere else in our respiratory surface. So there's not diffusion of gases in the trachea or the pharynx or the nasal cavity. It only occurs at the ends, the very ends, which are called the alveoli. So you can see that the alveoli, because of the way that they're shaped, they have a large surface area. And they are very thin. So they are composed of simple squamous epithelial tissue. So what does squamous mean?
Square layer.
Nope, that's cuboid. Flat. So flat, squashed. So think squamous. Right? So it is a layer of flat cells, and this is where diffusion takes place. So oxygen diffuses from a higher concentration into the blood. Oops, oxygen, and CO2 diffuses out. So simple squamous epithelial tissue. Okay. We talked about that. Okay. So let's talk about respiration in fish. So fish have gills. Right? So gills are generally associated with aquatic organisms. So that means that they are getting oxygen from the water. Now, do you think that oxygen is more concentrated in water or in air in general? It's actually more variable in water. So O2 concentrations in water are more variable. As in, there can be very low oxygen or very high oxygen. So what do you think determines whether that concentration is high or low?
Depth.
Depth, if it's moving. And what about temperature? Which one would be better, cold or hot? Cold, right? So cold water, we have an increase in O2, right? And then movement. So when they go over the rapids, right, that actually increases the concentration. So cold streams that are in the mountains and they're falling over rocks, their oxygen concentration would be very high in that type of water. Okay, so movement. So stagnant, warm bodies of water, oxygen is low. So this actually causes quite a bit of problems when you think about dams. Because when we think about salmon in particular, when they're trying to move from a freshwater to the marine environment, they have to go through the dams. And a lot of dams draw their water from the bottom of the reservoir. And that is where the bottom of the reservoir is going to be cold compared to the top. So they go from being in kind of a warm-bodied water, and then they get shot through the air, right? The cold water comes up, it wells up, and then they shoot it through the, what is it called? The floodgates, well, yeah, I don't count the gates, right? And so what sometimes happens is that the oxygen will flood into their gills and will actually cause air bubbles, and their gills will explode because they went from a warm body to cold and super oxygenated as that water is being, moved out through the dam. So one problem with being aquatic is that you have to deal with these differences in oxygen concentrations in the water. Okay. Also, we have to talk about ventilation of the gills. So this, in this case, is the movement of water across the gills. Okay. This is actually quite energetically expensive compared to the movement of air because water is heavier. So this takes more energy than moving air. So this is where the operculum that you saw in your perch comes into play. So when they're taking in water, the operculum opens. water moves in through the gills. Actually, sorry, I screwed that up. This is where we'll start, we'll do mouth. So let me just go down here. So the mouth opens. I was thinking about this backwards. The mouth opens, water moves in. The mouth closes and water moves out through the operculum. So actually you can just cross that off. Okay. So water comes in the mouth, right? And so they open their mouth, water floods in, and then they have the operculum closed. And then when they close their mouth, the operculum opens and the water moves out through the gills. So if we look at a diagram that shows this from your book, this is a diagram. So water would move in and then it would flow out. And so as it flows out, it's going to flow across the gills. Now fish actually have an interesting mechanism which is called a counter current exchange. And this is between, this exchange is between the blood and the water. So countercurrent would be different than concurrent. Concurrent would mean that everything is flowing in the same direction. So countercurrent means that your blood is flowing in one direction and the water is flowing in the opposite direction. So as the water is moving out, the blood is moving through the gills in the opposite direction. So we can show it looking like this. So the blood moves in one direction and the water moves in the other. So the reason why this is useful is that actually this helps to maintain the difference in partial pressures. So this maintains difference in partial pressure. So that was part of our equation. Right? So let's say that water was coming in and it was like 20%, and then it's going to decrease to 5%. Okay. Blood is coming in, and let's say that this is 4%. This would be like 9%, and this would be like 15%. Okay. So these values probably aren't quite valid, but just showing you how even at very low, which way is the oxygen going to flow? It's going to flow from the water to the blood, even at very low oxygen concentrations, right? And so this is different than if it was going the same direction. If it was going the same direction, then we would get something like this happening. Right, so if blood was coming in, water was coming in at 20%. What was the highest? 15%, 10%, 10%. Okay, so what this means is that at 10%, right, there's going to be no exchange between the blood and the water because their delta P goes to 0. And once you put a 0 into that equation, there is no diffusion. Diffusion just stops. So we see this counter current exchange system happening. We also sometimes see this with heat. So the reason why ducks' feet don't freeze is that blood coming in to the feet actually flows in a counter direction as blood leaving, and there's some exchange of energy there. And so we see these counter current exchanges to regulate temperature as well as to regulate differences in pressure, because heat flows just like diffusion of molecules. Heat will go from a higher to a lower molecular movement. Okay. Okay. So if I asked you to give me an example of a adaptation that affects the rate of diffusion, you could say the countercurrent exchange between the blood and the water affects the delta P, and that is what keeps the diffusion going. Okay. Okay. So let's look at amphibians and reptiles. So you'll remember that the fish have a lung derivative, and it is called the swim bladder. Okay. So here they have a picture of the sturgeon, and the swim bladder is just an outpocketing of the pharynx. And then as we start to see the evolution of amphibians, this swim bladder becomes useful in the in breathing air. So here, for example, the swim bladder is increasing its surface area, and we're starting to see it used as a lung. And so here, these would all be the fish leading up to the evolution of the tetrapods, which would be the amphibians. Okay, so this swim bladder gave rise to the lung in amphibians. But remember that some amphibians still retain gills. So that would be an example of paedomorphosis, like newts. Newts stay as aquatic and they have those gills, like the rough skin newt that have the toxin. That would be an example of an amphibian that has retained its gills. So this is useful in breathing air. So the lung is actually an adaptation to a terrestrial lifestyle. And the function is that it prevents excessive water loss. And that is due to having the respiratory membrane on the inside of the organism. So interestingly, when we see reptiles rely solely upon their lungs to get oxygen. What other ways do amphibians breathe? Does anybody remember?
Their skin.
Their skin, right? So when we look at the reptiles, they don't use the skin for respiration because they have scales. So when we look at the reptiles, they start to have lungs with a greater surface area. So lungs have a greater surface area. So that would be another adaptation that you could say, well, the reptiles compared to the amphibians have a greater surface area, which increases the rate of diffusion of gases across the surface so that they are more efficient at breathing air than the amphibians are. So if we look at a diagram that shows this, so this is my amphibian lung. My reptile lung's bigger in this case, but it also has a greater surface area. And then the mammalian lung takes it even to more extreme, right? By having these branches of tubes, and then at the very end, having the alveoli. Okay. So birds actually have, I would say, a better system of respiration than we do, because they do not have any dead air or unoxygenated air left in their air sacs, right? Or left in their respiratory membranes. So they have a one-way flow of air through their lungs. Okay, so you could put mammal lungs or mammalian lungs are dead end alveoli. So we actually have to breathe and get rid of the dead, what they call the dead air. It's not living, but it's the unoxygenated air. So that says mammalian lungs are dead end alveoli. So the lungs of the birds are called parabronchi. And this is where the respiratory surface is located. And then they also have air sacs. So one interesting thing is that they breathe and it actually inflates their body and actually makes them lighter. So that's why birds tend to be, if you pick them up, they can feel really light because when they breathe in, it fills up their air sacs. But the air sacs are important for flight, but they're also important in keeping the air moving through the lungs in one direction. So this is their respiratory surface, right? Air is moving in one direction rather than having those alveoli like we do. And so in order to get the lungs, to get the air through, they have to breathe in and breathe out twice. So what happens is that they breathe in and it goes to these posterior air sacs. And then as they breathe out, the air moves through the lungs to the anterior air sacs. And then when they breathe in again, the air will then move out, right? So you don't need to know that inhalation, exhalation in birds. You just need to know that their respiratory system is just unidirectional, right? So sometimes we can breathe so shallowly that we have a lot of extra air that kind of stays in the alveoli. So then we end up taking some deep breaths, right? Because we've been breathing too shallowly. Okay. So let's talk about respiration in mammals. So we have the conducting zone. So we should, for optimal use of our conducting zone, we should not mouth breathe, right? We should actually breathe through our nose, okay? So when we look at the nasal cavity, when we breathe in, we have hair noses, or nose hairs, I mean. We have nose hairs, right? Right at the beginning. Those nose hairs pick up debris from the air. So if you're breathing in your mouth, that debris can get into your lungs, which might be a bad thing, especially if like you work at a coal mine, right? You're going to get coal dust into your lungs and you're going to get black lung from it. The problem is that then that collects and then you get, you have to clean them out, the hair. So if you've ever worked in really dusty environments, you know that your nose gets all stuffed up because you get so much debris stuck in there. Okay. So this helps to filter out debris. We also have sweat glands, and this humidifies the air. So sometimes when it's really cold outside, your nose will run, right? And that's probably because it's not evaporating like it normally would in the warmer weather. Yeah.
So what do humidifiers play? Like what is
that prevents, so if you humidify the air, that prevents your respiratory system surface from getting too dry. So if you I always remember sleeping with a wood stove. I hated it because I would wake up in the middle of the night and I'd be dying of thirst, right? And I had to drink a lot of water during the night. But if you put a kettle of water on there, that humidifies the air, so you don't lose so much water to the air. Yeah. So generally, we just have to, and that actually helps if you're sick, right? That kind of helps you breathe better if you're sick. Okay. So we also have mucus and cilia. So we are able to capture debris using the mucus, and the cilia can move it down the back of your throat. And so you're kind of always producing mucus in your nasal cavity, in the part of the nasal cavity where you can't reach with your finger, right? There's a big part up here. And that is just capturing debris and moving it down your throat so you swallow it. We swallow a lot of mucus over the course of a day. Okay. Then it goes into the pharynx. And remember that the pharynx is the common opening to the digestive and respiratory systems. So this is where we swallow, but we also have to breathe. We have to get air into the pharynx, right? Now we want the air to go into the trachea. Okay. There is a structure which prevents food from getting into the trachea, which is called the epiglottis. So the epiglottis prevents food from entering. So when we swallow our bolus of food, it causes that epiglottis to fold over and prevents it from going into the trachea. Okay. We also have the larynx. And this is our voice box. So this is where we have vocal cords, which are connective tissue that vibrates as we force air through, and that vibration comes out as sound. Males tend to have a larger larynx, which means they tend to have lower voices. Hence, the Adam's apple is just an enlargement of the larynx in males. Then it goes from the trachea into the bronchi. So there's two of these that go to each lung. Okay. So our lungs are protected. They're in the same thoracic body cavity as our heart. So the bronchi branch off, and then we go to bronchioles. So these are small passages that ultimately lead to the alveoli. Okay. Alveoli are not conducting, right? They are actually the respiratory zone. But all of this other part, there's no exchange of gases. It only takes place in the alveoli. So we have to ventilate our lungs, and we actually have a very interesting mechanism compared to, say, for example, frogs and lizards. And that is due to a muscle. And what is that muscle that separates the thoracic from the abdominal cavity? The diaphragm. Okay. So the diaphragm is involved in ventilation. So in your book, they have this diagram. And so notice that the diaphragm sits underneath the lungs. It is going to affect the volume of the lungs, and hence the pressure of the air, and whether air is going to come into the lungs or out of the lungs. So only mammals have a diaphragm. Okay. So mammals, we'll put only, have a diaphragm. Which means that we have what is called negative pressure breathing. So this is versus positive pressure. When you are in the hospital and if you had to go on a ventilator, they force air into your lungs, right? So they force it using a machine. They force air into your lungs. That would be positive pressure. We do not breathe like that. We do not gulp air. So frogs and lizards have to gulp air. They actually have to force air into their lungs using their muscles of their pharynx. So we do not gulp air. So this negative pressure breathing has to do with the way that the pressure automatically causes, the negative pressure automatically causes air to move in. And this is due to the movement of the diaphragm. Okay. So on inhalation, the diaphragm contracts. And it is normally a dome-shaped muscle, or muscle like this. So normally it's pushing on the lungs. So when it contracts, it actually kind of flattens out and it moves down, right? So that would be the diaphragm contracting as it goes from being this big dome to flattening out. So what do you think that is going to do to the volume of the lungs? Increase. So we have an increase in lung volume. So if I increase the lung volume, what is going to happen to the pressure in the air? Going to be negative or positive? Negative, right? So we decrease the pressure and air automatically flows in. Now, when we think of it, this is kind of backwards to what we feel. Because on our exhalation, when we're breathing out, the diaphragm actually relaxes. And I think when we think about exhaling, I think the reason why we think that muscles are contracting and the diaphragm should be contracting is because when you forcefully exhale, you also depress your rib cage and you might suck in your belly, right? So if I'm gonna try to exhale all the air out of my lungs, I'm gonna try to press in and squeeze my lungs, right? But the diaphragm actually relaxes. And so that is opposite of what you would think by just feeling it. And so what that means is it becomes a dome shaped, right? This decreases lung pressure, right? So this increases lung pressure. Oh, sorry. Increases lung pressure, but decreases lung volume. So air automatically flows out. So this is what we would term ventilation of the lungs. So this would be ventilation. Okay. So why don't we take a break until 1:20 and then we'll come back and talk about some lung diseases. And then we'll talk about a little bit about the circulatory system. Is there anybody in here that did not get the homework that is due on Monday? So I have an extra copy of it. No?
Yeah.
Yes.
When it comes to the larynx with voice box,
It might enlarge it. I would imagine it enlarges. Because it also makes you more muscular.
Yeah.
So it makes you hairy, probably enlarges your lungs.
Okay, that's what I was thinking. That's what I asked.
Yeah. Birds have a really interesting larynx. And it's actually 2 tubes. And that's why they can.
This was too small, but I don't know if she's getting that. It's just like, but I can actually. No, yeah, it's gonna change. These are just samples. You know, like a t-shirt.
Yeah.
We're gonna get that. So they can take ours. These are like, it's like a harder material. It's kind of weird. I don't really like it.
For dolphins.
Oh, he brought
That's
that. That's a
true.
bad shirt. He brought it. Let me try that one. There was paint. Let me know what it is. And then it was that. Wait, what am I-
I was studying. Great test.
Yeah. And like,
Yeah.
I know, there's really like two issues. Yeah. I know it's great.
Cheers. You guys have any good night?
Absolutely.
Sepsis. I did this one. I was an exam. So it's going to be 11:30. Our outage last night. Okay.
It's okay.
Was it hard?
No.
Oh,
It was like that. It was,
and they said just perfect.
yeah, this truck's fire. It's fire. We're all right. I mean, it's just like less and
Now you just have to pay out the first car that was super icy. He was going to live past them. Yeah, with a different car. Yeah, locked and slid right across this intersection. You know, the expenses of how that they have like railroad ties.
Yeah.
Drilled all that. And my car was like, and then the whole front piece was dented in the engine. I was shit.
Yeah, I
was
didn't
so
think anything like.
I don't remember going 30 on this icy power road. Had kind of a high floor high voltage at the 250, like 1980 something. And he lost control and slipped. And 30,000. And 30,000. And it was resting on the cab. And if he didn't have like a headache rack or lumbar thing in the back, he would be resting.
Oh my God, this is tragic. He was coming down. And hit the gravel.
Like everything on the top of my leg is such.
Flips it twice in the air into the bottom.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I was trying to completely destroy that. It's like a week old. 28, yeah, 2018. Absolutely. Yeah, this was what I used to. December, like before the break. So he was on his policies and the mom they were married. Yeah, he's really you know, I got the paper. It was like crashes, paper. Yeah. But it's kind of all so like it brand new, yeah. A little more careful. Yeah, but it's on. And just find out. That's not the problem. Right spot.
So we have to driving to that.
I don't know. I wasn't there. Yeah, I only go one thing. Not too bad.
Okay, so let's talk about some respiratory disorders. So, is there anybody here who has asthma? Okay. So, do you cough up phlegm or is it a dry cough?
Pretty dry.
Dry cough, right? So this is associated with kind of wheezing and a dry cough. So this is oftentimes due to an allergen. So it is related to allergies. So people that have allergies are more likely to have asthma. And it is due to a constriction of the bronchioles. So this could be due to, sometimes it happens more common in exercise. Sometimes it's cold air, right? And so one thing that they do is that they use a bronchial dilator. And so these people who have asthma might have a, what do they call it, a inhaler, right? So the inhaler is a bronchial dilator. And does anybody know what it's called? It is a steroid called albuterol. Oops, I spelled dilator wrong. There's no there's dilator. There we go, sorry. Okay, so if we look at an image of this, this would be a person who is having an asthma attack, right? And you get spasms. So the spasms in that airway constrict the airflow, but notice that the air sacs are normal, and notice that there's relatively little mucus production, okay? So that is different than some of the other diseases that we see, or respiratory disorders. So one respiratory disorder could be bronchitis. So this is inflammation of the bronchioles. So itis generally means, when you see it, means inflammation. So that would be the inflammation of the bronchioles. This could be caused by a bacterial or viral infection. And you get a productive cough. And generally, in order to be chronic bronchitis, it has to be like over 3 months. So you're just coughing constantly. So this can actually be also due to cigarette smoke. Oops. Oops, smoke or other pollutants. So that's why we have regulations about air quality in the workplace. Air quality has to meet OSHA's standards, right? So that if you're being, if you're a worker and you're being unnecessarily exposed to pollutants that could lead to, like asbestos, that could lead to things getting in your lungs and causing bronchitis, you're kind of protected against that. So okay, go ahead.
I was just going to ask if there's a higher percentage of cases of bronchitis and lung infections like that in larger cities.
Asthma is associated, and I would imagine people like that live in smog, like you're talking about Beijing, would probably have a higher incidence of bronchitis as well. Yeah, so I would imagine that's why they say don't go outside, you know, when it's smoky outside, because that can lead to bronchitis. Yeah. Okay. So the other disease that is oftentimes associated with bronchitis is emphysema. But this has another function. It's not the bronchioles, but rather it is destruction of the alveoli. So air is getting into the lungs, they're getting into the alveoli, but some of the alveoli are becoming damaged. And we also get thickening of the respiratory membrane. So both of those things, the destruction of the alveoli, this decreases your surface area, right? So that's going to decrease your rate of diffusion. You're not going to get enough oxygen diffusing in. And then this is also going to decrease, or this is actually going to increase little d in that formula, right? So that's going to increase the thickness of the respiratory membrane, so that will decrease diffusion. So generally with emphysema, you see people that are generally older, and they also get really, really skinny. And the reason why they get skinny is that they just aren't getting enough oxygen to their body to support their metabolism. So their metabolic rate is not functioning properly. Okay. So if we look at these two in comparison, so this would be an example of a normal bronchiole right here. And this is an example of one person that has bronchitis. And so sometimes people think they need to go in and get antibiotics for bronchitis. And sometimes that does help if it's bacterial in origin, but it will not help if it's viral in origin. So you kind of have to play it by ear and be careful that you're not taking antibiotics when you don't need to be taking them. And then emphysema can also be due to cigarette smoke or exposure to environmental pollutants. And so notice that the alveoli just becomes not as, it kind of expands and then it becomes thick. And then we don't have normal gas exchange taking place. So there's really nothing you can do once the alveoli become damaged. There's no way to repair the alveoli. So after you stop smoking, for example, there would be no way to go back. Yeah.
So I know that some of our cells that, like, once they develop into something, they stop. Are the alveoli considered those type of cells?
Yeah, I don't think that there's stem cells that can repair the damage in the lungs. So, you know, like your liver cells can regenerate. Even your kidney is really amazing at regeneration, but I don't think your lungs regenerate. Yeah. So when we look at the people who have this, they oftentimes get what is called COPD. So this is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And this can easily lead to death. And these are generally the people that have to be on oxygen at all the time. And so it's interesting if we look at the people who have COPD, and it's very, very common in the population now because a lot of them used to be smokers. So you notice here is current smoker, former smoker, and then only 25% of COPD patients are actually non-smoking. So that could be the people that work in the coal mines or other places where there's lots of toxins. And then interestingly, you can see that it is more common in women than it is in men. And it is actually really common in non-Hispanic white people. Okay, so it's less common in other populations. And so it is the fourth main cause of disability, and lots of money is spent in treating it. So there's a reason why we probably need regulations about cigarette smoke. And I don't know, I was actually raised with a chain smoker who wouldn't even let me, I have a lot of anger about this, but he wouldn't even let me roll down the window, for Christ's sakes, while he was smoking in the car. Like just cigarette after cigarette. If I rolled down the window, I would get in big time trouble. So, you know, there's really a good reason why we have these rules and regulations about even secondhand smoke is bad, 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 bad.
Like when they pass laws for like bars to have
yes,
designated smoking areas.
Yes, or just smoke free. We can't, you know, or not smoking in front of doors, right? Okay, so we're going to start talking about circulatory systems. And we have already talked about circulatory systems in some organisms because we've compared the difference between a closed system, which we see here in like the earthworm, versus an open system like you see in the arthropods. And one of the characteristics of an open system is that there are holes in the heart so that blood is pumped out to a common cavity and then simply has to percolate back through the tissues and go back into those holes to be pumped out again. So really the closed system is probably more advantageous than the open system. But if you think about honeybees, they are really active, right? What mollusk has a closed system? What's an example of a mollusk that has a closed circulatory system? An octopus. So only the really active ones, the squid, the octopus, and the nautilus, have a closed system, where all the other mollusks have an open system. Oops. Okay. So our circulatory fluid is the blood. And the blood consists of cells. And we have different types of cells. So for example, we have red blood cells. And we have white blood cells. These have more complicated names. They're called erythrocytes and leukocytes, which you don't need to know. Does anybody know why the red blood cells are red? Hemoglobin. So these contain hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is called a respiratory pigment. Because it binds reversibly with oxygen. So that's with oxygen, with O2. So that means that it needs to pick up the oxygen and it needs to transport it. Our blood is red because what does it have in it? It's got hemoglobin, but what is the mineral that is in the hemoglobin? Iron. And so what do you think about when iron is exposed to oxygen? What happens to it? It oxidizes and it turns red, right? So this is iron. Right? So we actually need iron in our diet to produce hemoglobin. Other organisms like insects have copper instead of iron, and that is why they have blue or green blood. And so when copper oxidizes, it turns from an orange to kind of a turquoise, right? And so that's why some invertebrates have blue blood rather than red blood. The white blood cells are important in immunity. And one of the things that they do is that they are phagocytes. So what a phagocyte means, phage means feeding, and this is cyte, which means cell. And so this is a cell that eats other cells. So it eats microbes and defective cells and cancer cells even. So we have white blood cells that can detect if a cell is cancerous and can actually attack it and destroy it. So it's believed that we all have cancer cells that arise all the time during our life. And if we have a strong immune system, like when we're young, we're able to fight it off before it becomes a problem. But in people that get older, their immune system declines dramatically. And so that's why cancer tends to be more common in older people than in younger people. So if your immune system is weakened, you're more likely to get cancer. We also have platelets. And what are platelets involved in? Does anybody know? If you don't have any platelets, what will your blood not do? Clot. It will not clot. So these are fragments of cells that help in blood clotting. So that is the cells that are in blood. We also have plasma. So sometimes they remove the cells, and the way that you can do this is you can take whole blood, like in a test tube, and you can spin it in a centrifuge, and all the cells, which are primarily red blood cells, go to the bottom of the test tube, and then you're left with this yellow stuff on the top, and that is what is called plasma. So this contains water, but it also contains all kinds of other things. So other substances in solution. Okay, so these include, right, ions. So ions are charged particles. So this would be like sodium, chloride, calcium, which has a 2 charge. Okay. These are also called electrolytes because they are a charge. Glucose is in the blood. And that video that we watched talked about how important this is because neurons in your brain run on glucose. We also have clotting factors, which are proteins, which are produced by the liver. Okay. And then we have we also have amino acids. And then we have a protein called albumin. And albumin is a really interesting protein because it is super abundant in our blood, but it actually doesn't do anything other than keep the solute concentration high so that in capillaries, water will move back up into the capillaries and not stay in the tissues. So I'm going to put that this is important in osmotic concentration. And we're going to talk more about that when we get to capillary exchange. So it's important in maintaining osmotic pressure. Okay. So there's lots of other stuff that are in the blood plasma itself as well. So if we look at a picture of the blood, we see here that we have red blood cells. And one of the interesting things about the red blood cells is they have no nuclei. So notice that there's no dark staining object in the middle. Blood cells, all blood cells are derived from stem cells that reside in your bone marrow. And red blood cells are so specialized in mammals and birds that they get rid of their nucleus. And so they have a limited lifespan. So red blood cells are not capable of reproducing because they have no nucleus. And so they live like 100 to 120 days before they are recycled. And one place that they're recycled in is the spleen. So we saw that organ, the spleen, when we were looking at that in the rat dissection. So the white blood cells are much fewer in number, and they have a nucleus. And there are different types of white blood cells that function in different forms in the immune system. And then we see those fragments of cells, which are called the platelets. So one way that platelets function is that if a blood cell becomes, or a blood vessel becomes damaged, then the platelets will start to adhere to that site, and they'll create a plug, which will prevent excessive blood loss. Because remember that in a closed circulatory system, we don't want to lose any of the blood. The blood, specifically the red blood cells, should remain in the blood vessels. And so this just shows a clot formation where the platelets that are produced by this large white blood cell that kind of blebs them off get stuck, and that is the function of the platelets, is creating a plug to prevent excessive blood loss. Okay, so we're going to talk about the circulatory system. And so the first thing we're going to talk about is the vertebrate heart. So when we look at fish, Fish have a really simple system, circulatory system. They just have a 2-chambered heart and 1 circuit circulation. So the way that this works is that blood comes in. I'll just draw it here. This is my atria. This is my ventricle. So blood comes into the atria. So this is my atria. The atria receives the blood that is returning to the body. And then the ventricle is a more muscular structure that pumps the blood. So the ventricle pumps the blood out to the gills. And then that is where oxygen is picked up at the gills. And then it gets pumped out to the body. And then it pumps it back to the heart. So that is a single circuit. We do not have a single circuit. We have a double circuit. Why do we have a double circuit? Anybody? Now, so what is a double circuit? What is the double circuit that we have?
Both sides.
We have a 4-chambered heart. Does the blood would go out to our lungs? Does it go straight out to our body, or does it go back to the heart? Back to the heart. And so that is the double circuit. So in a double circuit, okay, the blood returns to the heart after being oxygenated. And then is pumped out to the body. Okay, so hence that is why it is called a double circuit. And the double circuit is good because if you think about it, blood going to the gills is going to have to go to the capillaries, which are really small vessels. And there's going to be a lot of resistance to flow. And so the blood is going to slow down as it goes to the capillaries. And then that slow moving blood then has to go to the body, where it's going to go through more capillaries. And then it finally gets back to the heart, where it gets a boost, right? So the double circuit circulation helps to maintain a higher blood pressure. Okay. So the 2 circuits that we see in amphibians and reptiles and mammals are what are referred to as the systemic circuit. So these are the 2 circuits. 1, the systemic circuit, that's out to the body and back to the heart. So what's the second circuit? If it's not systemic, it would be, what is another word for lungs? Pulmonary. So this would be the pulmonary circuit. So this is out to lungs, back to heart. Now, since you're having the blood return back to the heart, you're having oxygen poor blood and oxygen rich blood return back to the heart, then it would be really good to have them separated, right? Which is why we have a 4-chambered heart. But when we look at amphibians and reptiles, they have a 3-chambered heart. Okay, so when we look at amphibians and reptiles, we'll put most reptiles. Crocodiles and alligators essentially have a 4-chambered heart, and most reptiles. Okay, so we have 2 atria because the blood is returning back to the heart twice. And we have 1 ventricle. And hence, this is the purple. So why do you think that this is purple instead of red and blue? Nope. It's mixing, right? So it's a mix of O2 rich and O2 poor blood. So it is essentially, because we have only 1 ventricle, it's getting mixed in there, and hence we get the purple coloration. Okay. So if we compare this to what we see in mammals and birds, we have a 4-chambered heart. So this is the actually this is like a reptile. Notice that it almost has complete separation, but not quite. Okay. So we'll put mammals and birds. They have a 4-chambered heart. And the advantage of this is we have complete separation of O2 rich and O2 blood and O2 poor blood. Okay. This is related to endothermy, because you're getting more oxygen, so your metabolic rate can be higher, right? You're producing more energy to regulate your body temperature, and you need more oxygen to do that. And so by separating those out, that is the function of the heart. But I want to show you that the heart is kind of a weird, if you're thinking about a pump, like if you're putting in a pump in your pond, this is the fish heart. Makes sense, right? It totally makes sense. You draw water in and you pump it out. When you look at the heart of the mammal, notice that it is a blind-ended pouch, right? There's this weird blind-ended pouch. The ventricles don't go anywhere. And so blood flow in could actually damage the ventricles, so that we have to have a mechanism by which blood comes in, and then the pressure pushes it back out.
Is that why we have increased blood pressure to help with that process?
And also that we need oxygen. We need more oxygen because we're endothermic. Yep. Okay, so I'm going to stop there for today. And don't forget to do your homework. And we'll have lab tomorrow. You know, I haven't quite decided yet. I have a bunch of labs I could do. We might, you know what we will be doing is we'll be, somebody in your group needs to place their face in water and hold their breath. So if you have long hair, you might want to bring a rubber band, right? So, and maybe not wear a lot of makeup. Makeup becomes a problem.
Thank you. See you tomorrow.
Yep, see you later.